probably one of the most horrendous crimes that I've come across.
I used to find myself in the garden in the middle of the night, standing out there by myself crying my eyes out.
David Fuller thought he'd got away with it. 34 years ago, the electrician murdered 2 women in Tunbridge Wells, but those murders were not his only crimes.
I had spent 2 wonderful hours in the mortuary, sleeping with her, and that gave me some sort of comfort. Little did I know that my daughter had been violated.
There's many ways to break the law. Moral depravity knows no limits, but even then, some criminal acts transcend even the most heinous crimes. Today, we are going to be talking about one such criminal act, about how one man has somehow redefined the word despicable by engaging in conduct you thankfully don't hear about often. The way this monster was able to carry out his assaults has raised some important questions. It was pretty much by chance he was caught and actually stopped. Like a ghost, he haunted the narrow hallways he inhabited, blending in and carefully planning his crimes, and even video recorded thousands of disturbing incidents. He seemed confident he was never going to get caught, and his history with the law goes back to at least the Bedsit Murders back in the 80s, where this story will be starting. Some have dubbed this Britain's biggest unsolved double murder, with the families finally getting justice 3 decades later. But it's far worse than anyone could have ever imagined, as one case closed, another 100 opened. This is the type of criminal you really should be scared of, a Ted Bundy type if you will. Intelligent enough to evade detection and cold-blooded like a reptile. Solving the double murders from the 80s led police to a man who they were forced to take a closer look at. What they found is enough to make Jeffrey Dahmer puke. We're going to step into the wild world of the self-proclaimed Necro Lord, the story of a sadistic killer and necrophiliac, a cunning and calculated killer that callously committed copious counts of crimes, unbothered and in the shadows for at least 30 years. In my opinion, people like this are terrifying. There is almost no telling the amount of horror that they have afflicted upon the world and its people, because most of it will likely never be found out. The same people that let him run free for 30 years are the same ones who are doing the investigation now. But there has been thousands of videos recovered as evidence, so this might be one of the few cases that are fully exposed. Either way, cue the trigger warnings and roll the title card. Enough preamble for today, let's get into it. Our story starts way back in 87 when a lady called Wendy Nell was found dead in a bedsit in Guildford Road, Tunbridge Wells on June the 23rd. She was just 25 years old and well liked in the area. Colleagues at work began to get worried when Wendy didn't show up for work, prompting them to call her boyfriend. He quickly went to go check on her, only to find her in a pool of her own blood. The intruder seems to have gained entry through the window, which was left open as no forced entry was present. She was sexually assaulted, beaten to death and just left there. It's a truly horrifying crime, but it didn't stop there. An investigation ensued, but the police were unable to find anything substantial. Then the unthinkable happened. Caroline Pierce, 20 years old, who also lived in a bedsit in Grosvenor Park, was murdered 5 months later, found semi-naked in a drainage ditch. Both women were in their 20s when they were sexually assaulted and strangled to death. They lived 1 mile apart and were missing their house keys randomly enough. This was reportedly taken as a form of trophy or keepsake by the killer. Either way, the circumstances were remarkably similar and both cases stunned the nation. The perpetrator was never actually apprehended and the murders stopped. The cases remained cold for 3 decades and were remembered as the Bedsit Murders. For a solid year, The people of Tunbridge Wells were terrified, especially the young ladies. It must have been awful for the families of the victim to go so long without catching this monster responsible. Wendy's mother, Pam, reflects on the years she spent without her daughter or justice in an interview with Sky recently.
Pam Nell's daughter Wendy was just 25 years old when she was found dead by her boyfriend in her blood-stained bed. She'd been sexually assaulted and strangled in her bedsit in Tunbridge Wells in Kent.
And this was a picture she asked me to take, to say that's a picture of the start of my new life. Didn't have much of it though, did she?
As the years went by, Pam believed the person who killed her daughter would never be found.
It was just the things that we lived through. You know, it wasn't something you knew. Well, once you go past a year, you think, oh well, it's never going to happen.
It was thanks to development in DNA testing in 2019 the killer was caught and brought to justice, giving closure to the families eventually. But this would only be the start for hundreds of other families, and this would send investigators down a rabbit hole nobody could have expected.
Wendy Nell and Caroline Pearce were both abducted and murdered by Fuller, their deaths dubbed at the time the Bedsit Murders. Tonight, Wendy's family finally know the man who killed their daughter has been brought to justice.
It hasn't sunk in yet. It's going to take a long while.
Although the guilty plea won't change anything deep down, as the pain and loss will always be there, it's good knowing he will not be in a position to hurt or cause any more.
DNA testing had advanced to the point where the two cold cases from the 80s could be forensically linked. This produced thousands of names from the National Police database. Eventually, they managed to identify 90 priority names from that list, and finally, one man was uncovered: David Fuller, a 66-year-old father of two that worked as an electrician in a hospital. Fuller was an unofficial photographer for the 80s band Cutting Crew, who sang Died in Your Arms. He and second wife Sally would tour the country following the band while they gigged. He started an affair with a nurse in 1990. She said in a statement to the court she found him to be a gentle man. She said, quote, "I thought he was serious about us. We would meet at the social club and he would come back to my address and we were intimate. He never stayed the night, and although we had sex, there was never anything kinky. He was a normal, loving man. He wasn't violent, he wouldn't shout at me, he was never sexually demanding." End quote. In his older age, it's reported that David settled down with his third wife, to whom he has 2 kids, and they lived a normal life. To anyone on the outside, that is. We know now that David was pretty much living a double life, one as a family man, the other as some sadomasochistic, necrophilic paedophile. One piece of info that I left out was a bloody footprint that was found during the investigation of the Bedsit murders. Police were actually able to obtain pictures of David from the 80s, the time of the murder, and they matched up. They concluded he was wearing the exact same shoes that would produce the pattern found in the blood all those years ago. They also discovered he was in a cycling club in the 80s that had a route going right by where Caroline's body was found, and if that wasn't enough, they also had evidence that strongly suggested he knew the 2 women, as he had visited both the stores that the ladies worked at. All this led them to David Fuller, who was apprehended at home and arrested. Case closed, right? Well, that would have been what investigators would have been saying if they had not found 4 hard drives stashed away in a secret hiding spot that contained 23 terabytes of data. The data was sadly not just ones and zeros, it was millions of images and videos of horrific crimes carried out over the years, dating all the way back to 2008. These images and videos were said to be so graphic, officers had to undergo special training before even watching them. Police also brought specialist computers to forensically examine the mountain of data from the digital devices. Films of David committing sexual acts on the corpses at the morgue where he worked, Maidstone and Tunbridge Wells. The CEO of the trust had this to say.
Made this statement.
Good afternoon. I want to say on behalf of the Trust how shocked and appalled I am by the criminal activity by David Fuller in our hospital mortuary that has been revealed in court this week. And most importantly, I want to apologise to the families of the victims of these terrible crimes.
Will you resign?
Pictures of deceased individuals, folders named after victims, and even one ominously named Necrolord. It said he even groomed the staff at the hospital so nobody would raise an alarm, going in on late shifts where he knew people were working who would just basically leave him alone so he could commit his horrendous crimes. Fuller had access to all areas of Kent and Sussex Hospital in Tunbridge Wells, which closed in September 2011, and the replacement Tunbridge Wells Hospital in nearby Pembrey. It's feared that he could have been carrying out the violations of bodies from when he first started working for the former Kent and Sussex Hospital in Tunbridge Wells in 1989, but that's yet to be confirmed. It is worth noting that 89 was the years that the murders stopped. After the horrific abuse, he used Facebook to track down the people he'd defiled and learn about their lives. The shocking mortuary material emerged during a search of Fuller's 3-bedroom house where he lived with his third wife, a nurse working at the same hospital, and their 20-year-old son. If it wasn't for the advancement in DNA technology, none of this would have been known. David has pleaded guilty to all the charges he is facing, but did not want to go into detail about any of it. Charges include, but are not limited to, the sexual penetration of a corpse, possessing extreme pornographic images involving sexual interference with a corpse, and taking indecent images of children. The ages of the victims ranged from 9 years old to 100. He was still working for the hospital when he was arrested, with people that knew him all saying he was a nice guy and fairly quiet. Everyone was apparently shocked by the story and in sheer disbelief at the extent of his perverse debauchery. Prosecutors say the case is unprecedented in legal history and the stuff of nightmares. And it really is. David was convicted for nearly 100 individual crimes, including the murders from the 80s, and he did try to plead innocent at first, but it didn't last too long. There is a short video of him admitting in prison as he is being questioned. It's eerie to say the least.
Morning. David, it's the police. Hello. David needs to come and speak to you. Oh, yes.
You here alone? No. David, you're under arrest on suspicion of the murders of Wendy Nell and Caroline Pierce in 1987. Do you understand? Yes. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defence if you do not mention, when questioned, something which you later on in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence. You are being arrested to secure and preserve evidence by means of questioning, so we can conduct searches, so forensic samples can be obtained, and to prevent your disappearance. Do you understand?
I want to admit that I am admitting the offences, but I don't really want to go into detail.
Yeah. Okay.
If you appreciate that.
And what offences are you admitting, David?
As you've just described to me.
Okay. In terms of the sexual penetration of corpses? Okay. And do you know how many occasions, David?
No.
No. Have you been recording yourself doing those things? Recording yourself sexually penetrating the corpses?
I admit that offence, yes.
Yeah? Okay. What did you retain the recordings for?
I don't know either.
Okay. Was it for further sexual pleasure, David? You know, in the same way as somebody would keep pornography or things like that? Was it for further sexual pleasure?
No.
Okay.
There's some stuff stuck on the back of that one as well. I've got the body worn on it, literally as it's happened.
What's that?
Well, on the back of his chest of drawers, it looks like he's got some hard drives in there, I would say.
Oh.
But they're stuck to the back of the chest of drawers.
Yeah,
Places,
and then it's got number 28, born, died, hasn't put a date, photo, born, died, no thing, photo, no bit. Number 48, date of birth, date of death.
He's identified the victims.
Sorry?
Those are the
Yeah,
victims.
well, the ones who...
No, they are. They're the ones in there.
I feel disgusted and shocked watching this footage. I mean, this is a real monster in the flesh. Proof that sights can be deceiving. Because he really doesn't look like that type of guy, if that type of guy even exists. I can't help but wonder, if I feel this sick about this story, how would a mother of a victim feel? I can't even imagine what it would be like for a lady named Miss Kemmel. Miss Kemmel received a visit from the police that I wouldn't wish upon anyone. Her daughter was sadly one of David's victims at the morgue. Miss Kemmel is a very strong and inspiring lady and has done a great interview which helps us gain a key insight into how David's crimes will continue to affect people long after he is locked away. I would truly love to be able to do a section for each and every victim as they all deserve it, but we will just take a look at one of the many people David hurt. I will try my best to give her a nice, informative and respectful chapter in the video that gives you a clear picture of the legacy she sadly left behind. We're going to be talking about Ezra Kemmel, and we will hear from her mum in just a moment. But first, I want you to know how she got to the morgue in the first place. From what I have read, Ezra was an incredible lady and had accomplished more than I ever will in the 24 years she graced us with her presence. A brilliant and compassionate article written by Jason Farrell, who you actually heard at the start of this video. He worked closely with Ezra and has written and done quite a lot about her. The article reads, quote, "When I met her, Ezra was training to be a lawyer at SLE, not bad for a girl who'd refused to go to her local pupil referral unit and, in part, been educated at home. She was smart, sassy, and she knew people on the street because, like her mother, it seemed to be her mission in life to help those less fortunate than her in the community." End quote. She died in a freak accident on the highway called the A21 in Kent, when her car burst into flames and she consequently had to flee. She was with a friend at the time and both of them managed to escape the fire just fine. Apparently she even tried to rescue her handbag from the car, so she wasn't in a panic about the fire or anything. For some reason she thought she might have had a better chance of getting help by moving to the other side of the carriageway. She was on what is known as the Medway Viaduct, which is a two-span bridge, and personally I've never heard of this before, but she climbed over the barriers in the dark. It was 2:30 AM in the morning, thinking that there was a central reservation because there normally would have been, but instead there was a 40-foot drop. Paramedics rushed to the scene but tragically couldn't save her from the impact of the fall. Her mother was obviously completely mortified and there is just no easy way around it. I'm sure her soul felt cold after that night and she lost a piece of herself. Our two stories collide when a year later in 2021, Miss Kemmel received a knock at the door. She's done a really good and incredibly emotional interview for Sky about the whole situation, and I think she's one of the bravest and strongest ladies I have ever seen. I want to share this with you and I do hope you feel the same. She goes into detail about it and the new story clarifies a few things. I wouldn't normally add something this long, but the person who is interviewed worked with Ezra and has written articles on her, and it's her mum, so it's two really good sources, and I feel like I'd be doing you a disservice if I didn't include it. So I'm just going to play the interview here.
It reminded me of when the two police officers arrived to tell me that Ezra had passed. There was this anxiety and they had this level of distress. I'm thinking, I don't have any family members, so why would they come at 8:30? They said to me, it's to do with Ezra. And for that moment, I'm thinking, I said to them, well, Ezra's dead.
They explained that Azra's body had been raped by an electrician in Tunbridge Wells Hospital mortuary. It would emerge she was one of at least 80 victims. He'd raped Azra hours before Nevras visited her daughter in the mortuary. What you're about to hear is distressing.
I had spent 2 wonderful hours in the mortuary, sleeping with her, and that gave me some sort of comfort. Little did I know that my daughter had been violated prior to that day and in the evening of that day. So whilst I'm stroking my daughter's hair, sleeping on her hair, a man had crawled all over her skin, and there's me kissing and cuddling and saying my last goodbyes. And that's quite awful, quite awful. However, it is not Ezra's shame. It is not my shame.
Maybe some would just bury their heads in the sand and not want to know any more detail. But you've actively kind of sought out the facts. You've wanted to know how long.
Yes.
When did he come in?
Yes.
What access did he have?
Yes.
You've found all of that out already.
Yes. And I tell you why, Jason, is that if you allow, for me personally, if you allow yourself to wonder what if, what happened, how could it have happened, how long, what did that person do, we spend a lot of time and energy creating confusion and pain in your mind. For me to have facts, I can focus on those facts and I can focus my energy on that, and I will never bury my head in any sand, and nor would have Ezra. I've thought long and hard about this interview, and I know that Ezra would be asking me, tell the story.
So you do have the detail, and you do know. The shocking thing seems to be that he had access for 20 minutes, half an hour.
Well, I'll give you the details, Jason. The first time was 13 minutes, the second time was 15 minutes, and the day that I visited Ezra and spent quality time, and my last time with Ezra, was for 35 minutes.
To understand this, Nevras asked the NHS Trust for a map of the mortuary. She learned that David Fuller had swipe card access because he sometimes did maintenance work there, and that he knew staff went home at 4 p.m. Porters might still visit the receiving area delivering bodies, but the same fridges had doors opening onto the post-mortem area, where Fuller committed his crimes. Here there was no CCTV until recently, and the fridge doors were unlocked. Fuller gained access through the utility rooms, but he still passed cameras en route and needed to swipe in.
He had entered the morgue and autopsy area thousands of times, not hundreds, but thousands of times. And no one ever stopped him or asked, well, what's this guy doing in here? He always made himself available to the mortuary staff. They thought that the perpetrator was a great guy. And basically, he groomed them. They became compliant. They never questioned him.
You've met some of those mortuary staff when you went down to see Ezra.
Yes, I did, and very, very good staff. But you could argue that who would think that someone would do such a thing? However, we have swipe cards and cameras for a reason. There was no logs about what he was doing in there. There was no logs of how many times he was going in there. He would actually abuse women whilst porters were bringing in dead bodies.
After Fuller pleaded guilty to double murder and the details of his mortuary crimes were revealed, the chief executive of Maidstone and Tunbridge Wells NHS Trust made this statement.
Good afternoon. I want to say on behalf of the Trust how shocked and appalled I am by the criminal activity by David Fuller in our hospital mortuary that has been revealed in court this week. And most importantly, I want to apologise to the families of the victims of these terrible crimes.
Will you resign?
In a meeting in October, Nevers told Miles Scott he should resign.
I said to him, if you're really, truly sorry, surely you will take responsibility and step down.
Nevers travelled to Kent for Fuller's trial to hear how his mortuary victims ranged in age from 9 to 100 years old, and that he also stood accused of double murder. If it was his only crime, Fuller would face a maximum of 2 years for what he'd done to Azra. Nevers says she will campaign to make legal guidance and sentencing stronger.
If he wasn't facing murder charges, the sentencing for this kind of offence, probably in your view, pretty minor.
Men and women up and down the country will be appalled by what they're listening to, what they've read about. And I remind them that if this was your loved one, you would roar with rage. And I'm silently roaring, and I'm beseeching people that make laws to create a law that this becomes an offence and the appropriate sentencing is passed down. And I trust the law in this country, and I trust the people of this country, and I hope they realise that they need to shout and scream and say, we need to respect the dead.
Azra was a friend of mine and helped me produce some of my reports here at Sky News.
And Azra, I know, is someone who, when she saw domestic abuse, for example, or violence towards women, she would go over to the guy who was doing that and kick them out of the house.
Yeah, that's live stories of Azra with her voice.
Yeah, so when she had a voice, she really spoke up for women.
Absolutely.
And people might say, oh, well, she was dead, she doesn't know anything about it. And you're more of the victim than she is. How do you feel about that? Because
Well,
you're the one that lives with it.
my daughter was the victim, and all those 98 people were victims, because I have respect for the dead. So they are victims. I am the victim's mother. I've tried to protect Azra all her life. And when she really was helpless, lying there still, being raped and abused, and couldn't scream out, couldn't call me, couldn't call the police, I will ensure that her voice is heard and justice is served. And that will be my mission.
Nevers believes the best tribute to her daughter is for lessons to be learned. The Hospital Trust has launched an independent investigation into whether anything more could have been done. Jason Farrell, Sky News.
I hope that did a good job of painting a picture of the lengths David went to commit these heinous crimes and what kind of an impact it would leave on a family member of one of the victims. How he went undetected for so long is just bizarre, and the fact that he was doing what he did to a dead body and that only carries a prison sentence of 2 years is also almost unbelievable. I think we all agree anyone who is doing that should not be let out for a long time. I want to say rest in peace to all the victims. They should have been resting in peace, but this sick monster, David Fuller, wouldn't even allow them the solace when they was deceased. This kind of story is certainly not one you hear about often, and good. Anyone wanting to do this does need serious help. This has been the story of David Fuller and the self-proclaimed Necro Lord, one of the wildest and awfulest cold cases I have ever discovered. Hope the families of the affected can move past this and heal, hopefully with David in jail and getting a full life term, meaning he will never see the outside again. They can continue to live their life without too much pain and trauma weighing them down. It's already hard enough losing someone, no matter how they go and no matter what time they go. Then for something like this to happen to the person that you love so dearly, I can't even imagine. I don't know if David needs help or the electric chair, but I do know he is sick, and I am very glad that he is caught now. But to think that he had 66 years to run free and commit crimes, I mean, gives me chills, and that will likely keep me up for a long time at night. But thank you for watching, wonderful viewer. That's you, the wonderful viewer. If you made it all the way to the end, I do commend you. I try to better myself in every video, but I'm still new to the whole YouTube thing. But if you did enjoy this video, consider subscribing. I mean, it helps the channel out loads, and I really do appreciate it. I mean, at this point, when I've got like 80 subscribers, 1 subscriber change makes my day. So, you know, feel free. But thank you all for watching. Take care of yourselves out there. Peace and love.